Dr. Maureen Osborne is a psychologist and gender therapist who has spent over 2 decades serving the needs of transgender clients. She didn't start out in practice to serve the transgender community, but one day, when a client showed up in Maureen's office believing they might be transgender, it proved to be a major turning point for her in her career as a therapist, and a starting point for her own growth in understanding the complex nature and needs of the transgender population. In this fascinating interview with PFLAG Cape Cod's Rick Koonce, Maureen talks in depth about her work with a variety of transgender men and women over the years. She describes the human anguish, confusion, and shame that transgender people often experience when they are trapped in bodies that feel alien to them. And she offers both compassion and hope to anyone who either thinks they might be transgender or who has embarked upon the difficult path of gender exploration and transition. From my perspective as a therapist, the rewards of this work are indescribably rich and gratifying, Maureen says. To assist in the emergence of a hidden human being, to help families cope with potentially devastating changes, to work on the cutting edge of a social and scientific paradigm shift, and to add my voice to the struggle for social justice. All these things have been my privilege to experience as a gender therapist. Maureen, welcome. So glad that you can be a part of our podcast series, Profiles in LGBTQ plus Courage. It's great to have you here today.
I'm so glad you invited me to speak. I've listened to your podcast and I think it's wonderful. It does a great service to the LGBTQ community. And although I'm not a part of that community, I'm a very loyal and loving ally, and it's wonderful to be here.
Well, and I know that you have a unique perspective on the LGBTQ plus community. You have been a therapist to the transgender community now for a number of decades, and really curious to dive into that and to learn what your experience has been. And could you talk a little bit about your career as a therapist and what being a therapist to the transgender community has taught you?
Sure. What I will say at first is that when I went to graduate school in the late 70s, early 80s, there was nothing that we learned in our program of studies about transgender people. They might as well have not existed. I had some training in human sexuality, but that's basically it. And I had been working for a while, maybe close to 10 years, and a person walked into my office, a 50-year-old man, who said that he thought he might be transsexual. And I said, okay, sit down and tell me about it. And he apparently had watched a Phil Donahue show, if you recall that show.
Yes.
He said that he watched someone and he felt that that person was him. And he was not a very well-educated person. He was a working class guy, but I immediately found him fascinating. And in a very short period of time, I'd say within a few months, there were 2 or 3 more people who came to see me, and it just kind of took off from there. And for me, it just was very exciting and interesting, these stories, and it seemed like a place that I could really contribute something new. At the time, there weren't very many people working in this field, so that was a lot of fun.
It's interesting because I know that you've written that as you began to work with this population, that your perspective on how to engage them changed. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. As you are trained to be a psychologist, there's sort of some ideas that are, sort of gospel about, being objective, not really being too close to the people that you talk with. And what I found was, well, first of all, these folks were very, very mistrustful of therapy professionals. And so they didn't come in and say, oh, I want to understand myself better. They came in with a lot of mistrust, but they were also in deep pain. And over time, I found that I could do therapy the way I usually did therapy, in the sense that I would take a history and learn about their family and their background. But after that, I was more of a listener than an active interventionist. First of all, I didn't really know very much about it. And what was written at that time, I remember going down to Giovanni's room in Philadelphia, which was a gay and lesbian bookstore. And there were about 4 books on the shelf on transgender phenomena. So there I was. The internet was really just starting to come in, but it was, of course, very important. So I learned that this wasn't the usual sort of definition of a problem and setting of goals. It was really a different process. First of all, over a period of time, I learned that being transgender wasn't a problem. I can talk more about that later. But the problem was how a person whose gender was mismatched in some way, and it was apparent to them, but they didn't really understand it, how that affected them in every moment of their lives, and how people's regarding them in a particular way that didn't feel like who they were, how difficult that was, and how, traumatizing. So, that made them feel like there was something wrong with them, something deeply wrong with them. But I learned that they were more or less regular people, and that what they were dealing with was social stigma and fears of the family. A lot of them were already, married with children. Back then, there were really not many young people who identified as transsexual or transgender, at least in public or in any kind of public sense. So I just sat back and tried to learn as much as I could. And I found that I would have to start doing things differently. For example, I started going to events that trans people attended. It was at the time a very underground community, but there were support groups, and I would go to support groups. There were conferences that were usually 3 days, 4 days on a weekend at a hotel. And for the first few years when I wasn't giving presentations, I was just attending them and being around people who are trans and really getting a sense of the breadth of the community, which is quite fascinating.
Yes. And, I think it would be helpful to our listeners if you could talk a little bit about the concept of gender dysphoria and what is it that a trans person experiences, the dissonance, the emotional and psychological and physical dissonance that they feel. How does that manifest itself? And what are the challenges that they have in navigating a world where they feel as if they're in the wrong body?
Let me start out by saying that gender dysphoria is a recent term, that it was called gender identity disorder for quite a long time. And the concept of gender dysphoria came about as an attempt to sort of depathologize being transgender.
Yes.
And that gender dysphoria sort of describes a feeling that people have that isn't necessarily just about being in the wrong body, because some people don't have what we call, somatic or body dysphoria, but that the dysphoria is that there's just something about the gender that people define me as that feels wrong or different or weird and makes me feel uncomfortable. Some people describe it as a buzzing in their head that's back in the background all the time. Some people talk about it as just a general sense of hopelessness, I guess, that the real them is never going to be able to be expressed in public because people are going to think they're nuts, or that there's some kind of perv, and so the vast majority of people that I saw in the early years, particularly, had kept it a secret for quite a long time. And so part of the gender dysphoria is the consequences of keeping something fundamental about yourself a secret from everybody that you love. Because if you feel that if you told them, they would, for some people that you get kicked out of the house. For others, you would just, they would treat you as if you were a freak of some kind.
Yeah. Well, I know you've written that in seeing clients, people come to you and they're weighed down in many cases with a sense of shame or guilt or self-loathing. Can you talk a little bit about that and how you counsel someone through that?
Yeah. Well, certainly shame and guilt and self-loathing are the big ones. And I think, my first effort is to more or less normalize their experience, even though it feels terribly abnormal to them. That, the beauty of coming to see a gender therapist is that they've seen a lot of people like this. And so they've come to see that this is just an aspect of the big, wide world of variation, and gender diversity is like any other kind of diversity. And maybe they aren't really happy that they got stuck with the gender diversity part, but that until they were able to accept and really embrace themselves as they are, that they were going to have a tough time. And so this is kind of where I start, is really helping them to kind of come to terms with who they are and to accept it. Not, and that can be very different for various people. Some people come in and they've already, kind of come to terms with that, and they want to just say, okay, what do I need to do to get the interventions that I want, the surgical interventions and so on. Because I don't know if we want to get into it now, but there's a whole sort of protocol for people who want to physically change their gender. And part of it involves seeing a therapist for a period of time. But other people come in and they want me to fix them, that this is awful. And what can they do to make it go away?
Yes.
And sometimes it's like a partner, or something, just notices that they are just so angry and depressed all the time. And so, they come in, and quite often, especially in the early years, they would tell me, and hadn't ever told another person in their entire lives what was going on.
Not even a spouse or a partner.
No. Most often not a partner. Although some people told their partners a little bit, just enough to make it seem innocuous, because they didn't want to feel too guilty. They might say, well, there's this thing sometimes I like to put on women's tights or, something like that. And it's really not a big deal, and blah, blah, blah. But that feeling of having been the first to be told, it's so sacred, and it makes me feel so honored, really.
Yes.
And I thank them for it. And I also give them hope, because I've worked with lots of people. I've seen people have good outcomes, not perfect, because none of us has a perfect outcome, but that this awful dysphoria that they feel all the time, they can do something about it.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about some of the clients that you have helped, and you've had quite a range of folks. So I'll let you kind of share maybe some brief case studies just off the top of your head, people that you've worked with. Can you give us also maybe a range of the different kinds of people?
Sure, I'll try that. So I will say that in the early years, I worked mostly with male to female transsexuals, because that's kind of what was in the media and so forth at the time. I rarely saw more transmasculine people, although I will add that over time I've come to see that there are no more male transsexuals than there are transmasculine people. It's just that transmasculine people can get away with sort of walking through life not particularly noticed, because women have a broader range of expression. You can wear sort of male type clothes. You can even be sort of butch and no one will
Mm-hmm.
really, blink their eyes. But if a guy comes out wearing a skirt and they're 6'2" and they're wearing makeup, that's not so well received, or hadn't been. So I think I will tell you about Alicia, and I'm going to read some of a case study that I wrote in a paper that I did. Alicia is an example of somebody who was one of the more successful cases, I'd have to say. So she came to therapy a pretty well-adjusted human, contentedly married for over 30 years with adult children and grandchildren, a satisfying job, active membership in a mainstream Protestant church, many athletic accomplishments, and a wide range of interests. She described periods of cross-dressing for, quote, as long as she had a conscious thought. She'd collect women's clothing items and then later purge them. That's a pattern that's very common for trans people as they go through life. That continued on and off through her marriage to Susan, whom she had promised that she would never again engage in such activities. But the promise didn't hold.
And if I may just say, at the time, Alicia, when she was not Alicia, was Alan. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yes.
She was Alan. And at the time, I will remind you that that the sort of powers that be in the gender community, the Harry Benjamin Association, as they called it at the time, were suggesting that people who wanted to have surgery leave their marriage, get a divorce. In fact, in the early years, they even required them to get a divorce. That since has changed quite a lot. So her promise didn't hold, and she wanted to tighten up her resolve, but she couldn't seem to do it. And she loved her wife and her family dearly and could not understand why the willpower that had worked so well for Alan for almost 60 years had failed her. Both she and her wife supported her coming into therapy, but her wife was not happy to hear me say that her husband's female side needed more, not less expression if we're going to learn where the balance lay. So some gender diverse people can find a balance where they take some time with female expression. Maybe they go out once or twice a month. They go to a support group meeting, or they go, somewhere to a restaurant, and that is enough for them. But over time, it seemed that Alan wasn't going to be satisfied by that. And he gradually realized that his so-called comfortable life was becoming more and more intolerable for him and for Susan, who wasn't ever going to accept her husband's female side, despite her efforts. So then he started to imagine a transition. And his wife was furious. And I saw her a few times, and I hooked her up with a therapist who was aware of trans issues. But it just, I think long-term marriages, for some people, you're very set in your ways, I suppose.
Yes.
And it just wasn't, she was a much more traditionally gendered woman. And the fact is, Rick, that, when people get married, the basis of the relationship is gender. Let's face it.
Yes.
You're either in a heterosexual relationship or you're in a bisexual or a homosexual relationship, but that person's gender matters. And that's the unspoken covenant that's between you. I married a man or I married a woman. And it's true even with, gay couples who one person transitioned, that they feel, the spouse feels betrayed, abandoned, lied to. The lied to is enormous. And I mean, the fact is, of course, there's a lot of lying that happens. And I don't think it's the kind of lie that is malicious. It's really the kind of lie that's meant to, soothe and reassure.
Yes. And so what happened to Alan, who really moved towards being more Alicia?
Well, Alan knew that he was going to need to start transitioning, told his wife, and she was very unhappy. She came out to her, I think it was 3 adult children who lived in different parts of the country, had children 2 out of her 3 children, well, all of them were shocked, of course, because this is, their father, the person they looked
Yes.
up to. But 2 out of the 3, came around and were very accepting and still have a relationship with Alicia. One of them was involved in a church and just really couldn't really come to acceptance. And even to this day, Alicia's wife has not been able to even come part way, even though so when the family gets together, it's like a real solid divorce. There's no interaction. So this sounds sort of pretty tidy, but it was a long time that it took her to get to this point. It was about 5 years of therapy, and throughout that she agonized over this. But now she wrote me pretty recently, a year or 2 ago. She bought herself a condo. She has relationships with lots of people, both in the gay and straight communities. She's had some, more romantic interests. And here's the kicker. She's still not sure about the gender thing. So it's quite an interesting, because she's a very introspective and intellectual person. She, when I asked her, well, what did you mean by that? She said, it's just so complicated, but you already know that. It seems to me to be a blend of unequal parts, external social constructs, an innate sense of self, hormones, and an X factor that I sense, but I can't quite grasp.
Yes.
Pre-transition, I was distinct. Pre-transition, I was intrigued by a gay relationship, but never felt gay. Yet I know I also had an attraction toward women. Add to that my knowledge since early childhood. I constantly dreamed of being a girl, only to learn it was socially unacceptable. I grew to become very, very confused. So I just tucked it all away in a sequestered corner of my brain, acknowledging that it existed all the time while going about trying to build a normal life.
So interesting. So she's a work in progress still, it sounds like. And
She is, but she said she's happy, and she ends up, she said, right now my life is pretty darn wonderful, and that's all the proof I need to know that transitioning was the right thing to do.
Yes, this is so interesting, and I think I'm wondering if maybe you can mention just 1 or 2 other client case studies, sort of briefly, just to give our listeners a flavor for the range of human circumstances that you have encountered.
Sure. Well, let's see. How about Clarissa, who was retired by the time she came to see me and had a very high profile life as a administrator in a large university and also as a local politician, and but knew for pretty much her entire life about her gender longings. And she came to see me, and her wife, as the kind of therapist I am, I usually ask to see their partners, any people in the family that will come into my office.
So again, just for clarity, Clarissa at the time was presenting or was known as male. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So it had a career as a man and all of that.
Yes. Oh, yes. And had adult children who had lives of their own and so forth, and had a very loving relationship with his daughters. They were daughters, but knew that was something that he needed to do. And so what happened was he was able to. His wife was really not wanting him to be anywhere near the community they lived in because they were well known and he had been a politician. So Clarissa went to live with her daughter in a big city and was a nanny for her daughter's child. And so had a lovely time of it. But unfortunately, she developed cancer, and it was a pretty serious metastatic cancer. So she was needing to go in for treatments, and she was very worried about being treated differently as a trans woman. So she transitioned back to male in order to go through her treatments. And ultimately she died. And She was very special to me. But the really part that made me very sad is that when she died, there was no trace of Clarissa. There was a funeral. There were articles in the paper about Alan. And, it was like her wife had won. Yeah. So it was very sad.
So sorry to hear that.
Yeah. Well, there are sad stories for sure.
As we talk about this, in your view, what are the biggest myths and misnomers about the transgender community?
Gosh, there's so many. I guess the first thing that I would say is that the myth of them being disordered, pathological, quite commonly thought of as sexually perverse, and even, in a religious context, some type of abomination, and another myth is that the deception myth, that they're doing this in order to gain some advantage. That's something that came out when they were trying to pass bathroom laws so that people who went to the bathroom could do so in the gender that they presented themselves, because it would look ridiculous and they would be in more danger if they went in the wrong bathroom. So the idea was that they were pretending that men were dressing as women somehow and pretending to be women so that they could assault people. It was a crazy.
Well, it's kind of, as one transgender person told me, who said that sometimes people view it as a cry for attention or something like that. And this transgender person said to me, believe me, nobody's doing this to attract attention. Far be it from that. It's quite the reverse. They'd like to do this, in a quieter, less visible way.
Yes.
And well, I have to ask, as a therapist, you've had so many experiences, and unfortunately, we don't have time to get to all of these. I think we need probably a couple of hours, but I'm curious what your views are when we think about traditional gender roles, male, female. Are those even legitimate terms to use, or are all people, to some extent, a little pansexual or gender fluid? What's your take on that?
Like many things, I think gender identity is a spectrum, meaning that there's kind of a line at which one end might be hyper masculine or hyper male, and the other would be hyper female. And people exist somewhere along that continuum. But when they ask themselves, am I a man or a woman? Usually they come up with one or the other. It's unusual to be sort of stuck at a midpoint, although it happens, and they call that sexually fluid or bigendered or two-spirit, those kinds of terms. Do I think that they're useful? I think that time will tell. I think evolution is such nowadays that, the binary isn't as crucial to the survival of the species. But I don't think that they're only social constructs. I do think that, part of the research that's been done on how transgender people have a biological component to their identity shows that it's not just a social issue. And there have been, if you remember, there was an attempt by the psychologist John Money to raise a boy who had had an accident with his penis being removed as a girl, saying, well, it's all just a social rearing. And it was terribly wrong in that young person. And, and they do that also with, there are intersex people who are born with genitals that it's hard to tell whether they're male or female. And in the old days, they don't do this so much anymore. They would just make a decision.
Yes. Yes.
And that did not always work out well. So I don't know if that answers your question. It probably doesn't, because I think it's a complicated question.
Well, and I know that you've written beautifully that, quote, biology sets out the blueprint for gender variance, and a person's life experiences or circumstances shape the way that variance is experienced. And can you elaborate just for a moment on that? Because it's a couplet to what we just were talking about.
Right. So biology, it can be chromosomes, it can be hormonalization in the intrauterine environment, it can be, well, those are the main things, or, which for some people make structures in the brain develop differently than structures than the body, the sexual development of the body. But depending on the kind of family you're in, for example, if you have a very sex role stereotype family where men are men or women are women, then, if you're feeling you don't fit into that category, that can make it much more difficult as compared to being in an open family where, nowadays some parents are happy to let their children express themselves in whatever gender they want to. And that's fine.
In a gender creative way. And actually,
Yes.
one of our other podcast guests recently was Laurie Duran, who's written a wonderful book called Raising My Rainbow, which is her story of raising a gender creative kid, as she puts it. And well, speaking of family, and from your perspective and experience as a therapist, if a person is thinking they might be transgender or feels definitely they are, how do you work with the family, or how would you coach and counsel that person to approach their family with this information?
Well, I think slowly and carefully. I think that it depends on if they strongly need a public transition, because there are other ways of learning how to be comfortable in your gendered self. It doesn't have to be public, but many people feel the need to be seen, and that, not just when you're in the bedroom or something like that. I usually ask people to start with one person that they trust unconditionally and to reveal themselves to that person. And then I think that it's very important to, if you have a spouse or a partner, that you reveal yourself to that spouse or partner, because it just isn't fair to have these thoughts and aspirations that you're working on in therapy that you're, not divulging to your partner.
Yes.
It's like, I think I said in a paper, it's like having an affair when the person you're having an affair with, you want them to come move in with you.
Interesting. And Maureen, just another couple of questions.
Mm-hmm.
I know you're not a child psychologist and you don't see children in your practice, but you've said that you occasionally see parents of gender questioning children. And I'm wondering, what's your advice to them?
My advice is that they should be open to what the child has to tell them about who they are, and not to comment on it in a disparaging way. I think that when they're young, that's very easy because they're just playing around the house and, or, with peers who are so young, no one really has a strong reaction. When they go to school, it's a little bit different. And you might say to them, if you, want to be a fairy princess, let's say it's a little boy, then probably it's best for you to do it at home, because, that's protecting a child, and children can be bullied at a very early age. But I do tell parents that there's really not much that I can do for them until a child reaches an age where they may be approaching puberty, because that's really the point where you can start to intervene if that child persistently and insistently and consistently tells you that they are in the wrong gender somehow. And at that point, there are things like puberty delaying hormones that will put off the development of, breasts or, other secondary sex characteristics that can be incredibly disturbing.
Yes.
And they're also not reversible.
Yes. And so besides seeking out a trans-friendly therapist, what's your advice as to where transgender people should go for resources, information?
Well, the internet is a godsend, and I know there are bad things on the internet, but nowadays the internet is full of YouTube videos of people talking about their own experiences. So if you're not ready to go out into the world, that's one way to start. There's PFLAG, of course, because PFLAG is a wonderful, accepting place where people can go and hear other people's supportive family stories. There are these conferences that, well, of course not right now, but when we're not in a pandemic, these conferences are all over the country. Pretty much any month of the year, there's a conference being held somewhere. And it's usually 3 or 4 days of being completely ensconced in your preferred gender role. In fact, there's one up in Provincetown on Cape Cod every year that goes for a whole week where people are encouraged to bring their spouses. And
That's Fantasia, right?
Yes, it is.
Yes.
And I go there and do a week's worth of workshops for spouses and couples, because nowadays it's not a death sentence to a marriage for a person to come out as trans.
Yes. Well, we've covered a lot of territory here, and there's so much more to cover. Before we wrap, is there anything in particular that I have not asked you about that you think is really important for people who listen to this podcast to know?
I guess the thing that I think is so difficult for most people who are trans is this thing that we call internalized transphobia, where the negative attitudes of the outside world sort of get internalized into the person, and it causes them to feel defective and wrong and like a liar or a fraud. And so basically they're kind of terrified. And to kind of be aware that even the slightest, using a wrong pronoun or the wrong name can just be devastating to a person who's trying their best to be seen.
And to find their identity.
Yes. Yeah. So that's one thing for sure.
Maureen, I want to thank you for taking this time. You just have a wealth of experience in this arena, and I think that your comments today will be of great value and benefit and comfort to those who listen to this podcast.
Well, thank you. I certainly hope so. I feel like we've barely scratched the surface, but I figured it would be like that.
Well, thank you so much again.
You're welcome.
Thank you for listening to today's interview. Founded in 1973, PFLAG is the first and largest organization for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer people and their parents, families, friends, and allies. We have over 400 chapters and more than 200,000 members and supporters nationwide. Our members come from every generation and live in cities, small towns, and rural areas across the United States. PFLAG is committed to creating a world where diversity is celebrated and all people are respected, valued, and affirmed. For more information about PFLAG, explore the rest of this website or visit PFLAG National at pflag.org.